Hello, you're with BBC News Live. I'm Catherine Byaruhanga. Welcome to Your Voice. Today we're focusing on efforts to end the war in Ukraine. A leaked US plan emerged last week with a 28-point draft that included some controversial proposals, including handing over territory Ukraine still holds to Russia, lifting sanctions on Moscow and limiting the size of Ukraine's military. Now, American teams are expected in both Kyiv and Moscow for continued negotiations, but the conflict continues on the ground. Ukrainian troops have been trying to hold back Russian forces in key eastern cities of Pokrovsk and Minorad. And strikes continue across Ukraine, including in Kyiv on Tuesday, where Russian missiles and drones killed 7 people. Now, using BBC expertise from across the region, we're going to answer your questions on where things stand and what happens next. Now, audiences from the BBC Ukrainian service have been sending us their questions on social media. On the BBC Russian service Telegram, we've had questions from their audience as well. And of course, comments from BBC News viewers here in the UK. Now, to help us answer your questions, we're joined by our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, who's live in Kyiv for us. Zhana Pesbiachuk from BBC Ukrainian, she's also in Ukraine. Sergei Goryashko from BBC Russian, he's joining us from London. And Orysia Lutsevich, head of the Ukraine Forum at the think tank Chatham House, she's also joining us here in London. Welcome all of you to the programme. We're going to start with this question from Kathy here in the UK. She asks, presumably the plan on the table means many people who regard themselves as Ukrainian will then be living in what would become Russia. What are the implications for them? Her question is echoed by Vasil in Kyiv. He asks, how will world leaders deal with this issue? I want to start with you, James, in Kyiv. Just as a beginning, can you just talk to us about which territories we're talking about here and why they're so important for Russian interests?
Well, they're important to Russia because it's what Russia has been able to grab after almost 4 years of fighting. The Russians occupy territory, broadly speaking, in 5 Ukrainian regions. And what they are calling for is the complete control of these regions. What Ukraine is resisting is being forced to hand over land that they don't occupy. And so within these individual regions, you have a fortified front line separating Ukrainian-controlled territory and Russian-occupied territory. Early on in the war, it was easier, relatively speaking, for those living under occupation to make it out, to make it back to Ukrainian-controlled territory. But of course, that would involve them leaving their homes. I think we're now at the stage where those who live under occupation have either chosen to do so or have been unable to leave. You often see people endure incredibly dangerous environments to try and remain in their homes for as long as possible. So should they wish to return to Ukrainian territory now, it is a less than straightforward path. It would involve travelling through Russia itself and finding alternative routes to Ukraine. And so there is this sort of societal division we have seen for some time now, where, in cities like Kyiv, you'll meet countless people from the east who have been separated often from their elderly relatives, who worry about them because the Russians control internet access, they control phone signal. And so the route out is a complicated one. It is not impossible, but it's a lot more difficult than it was a few years ago.
Let's bring in Zhana Pesbiachuk from BBC Ukrainian. Zhana, there is that question of how world leaders will deal with this issue, and crucially, what's the view from the Ukrainian government itself?
Yeah, this is one of the most sensitive and difficult issues with regard to this so-called territorial swap it's called like that by Russia. Also, we hear that Trump, the American president, uses this term. It's not seen like that exactly in Ukraine, within the country, because actually, if it happens and if it's the part of the peace deal, Ukraine won't get any territories back. Russia will have to stop its fighting. And also, the part of this possible deal might be that Ukraine has to cede some of its territories in the east, which are controlled now by the Ukrainian forces. And there are tons of people living there. And I have, to be honest, I know some of them and I know their opinions. For them, that's a pain, that might be a huge trauma, that they either lose their homes or have to find themselves suddenly citizens of Russia. At least Russia might regard them like that. It won't be recognized, of course, by Ukraine or the international community. And also, it's important to know that some of these territories that Russia wants to get from Ukraine within this possible future peace deal, they are totally devastated by the war and they are not suitable for the life of people.
Thank you, Zhana. Let's turn to our next question. This one's coming in from Victoria in Ukraine. She asks, my question concerns the so-called rare earth metals agreements that were supposed to take place in February 2025. What is the fate of this agreement? What does this agreement give Ukraine? I'll throw this question to Orysia Lutsevich at Chatham House. How would you answer that question from Victoria?
It's a very good question because it touches upon both security and economics. Ukraine understood from early days of Trump's administration that he's very transactional. And in order to keep American strategic engagement with Ukraine and to make it interesting as an asset for US business, they have put forward this offer of rare earth minerals to President Trump. Ukraine is indeed rich in minerals. It has several areas where there's lithium, there's titanium, and understanding that right now there is a certain battle for these critical minerals for different economies, and Western democratic world needs independent supply that is not coming from autocracies such as China, for example. It set up actually this Ukraine Investment Reconstruction Fund. It has been legalized formally now. And not only that, but Development Finance Corporation, which is US agency, has put in 75 million. This will be matched by Ukrainian 75 million. So there will be a fund of 150 million US dollars to start joint projects. We do know that there are bylaws and rules of how this fund will function approved this year. And as early as September already this year, there were visits to some of the sites near Kirovograd that are excavating lithium that could be potential investment by a US company called TechMet, where US government has a share. So this is progressing slowly, but to have at least one case of investment would be good to demonstrate Ukraine's value.
Orysia, thank you for that. And you mentioned the security aspect to any such agreement. We've had a question on this from Angelina, also in Ukraine. She asks, if previously granted security guarantees from America were violated, how can we rely on any future ones? I want to throw this to you, James. Do we know what kind of security guarantees are being negotiated? And how optimistic is Kyiv that the US will live up to those guarantees?
No, we don't have much of an idea at all, really. I mean, we've been speaking to officials this week who are being very disciplined, shall we say, about what compromises are and are not being agreed with negotiations with the Americans. You know, we had a leaked plan last week, this 28-point plan, seemingly put together by America and Russia. And in it, there was a clause saying there would be a coordinated military response, according to the wording, if Russia was to invade Ukraine again after this war was to end. But that, it's hard to see or gauge the Western willingness to go into direct confrontation with Russia if that was to happen, because you just need to look at the disagreement that is taking place at the moment. You've got an America that wants Europe to plug the security gap when it comes to Ukraine's future security, the continent's future security. You have Europe seemingly still reliant on America's military might in order to do that. And so making promises beyond the end of this war are very hard to visualize, but it is these kind of security guarantees that will allow or any kind of peace agreement to last. So we really don't have any idea what is being proposed in terms of troops on the ground, in terms of weapons that would be provided, in terms of what's being described as NATO-esque security guarantees. I mean, Ukraine isn't even a member of the military alliance. And as for Russia, Russia is not climbing down from its demand that there can be no Western troops in Ukraine after the war was to end. And so it is probably the stickiest of sticking points as these continued peace negotiations take place, but they are no less crucial to there being a lasting peace in Ukraine, which still feels very distant.
James, thank you. Let's turn to question 3. This comes in from a BBC Russian service audience member. They ask, what is happening in Crimea right now in connection with the war? What do we know about public sentiments there? Of course, Crimea is Ukrainian territory that Russia occupied back in 2014. Let's turn to Sergei Goryashko from BBC Russian. I guess the point this audience member might be trying to make is that there are parts of Ukraine that are supportive of Russia.
Well, if we're talking about what's happening in Crimea in terms of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, since 2022, Crimea Peninsula, especially military infrastructure, Russian military infrastructure in the Crimean Peninsula has been suffering from strikes from the Ukrainian army. And through the last months, we see that practically on a weekly basis, there are reports about drone strikes, missile strikes on Russian military installments on the peninsula. The situation is quite dire for the Russian military there, as lots of infrastructure being damaged or lost has been reported quite often. Russia has even decided to move its Black Sea fleet away from the city of Sebastopol, saying that the general staff of the Black Sea military fleet has been moved out of it. But since we're talking about the public sentiment, it's safe to say that we cannot tell much about it. This part of Ukraine has been occupied for more than a decade by Russia. And, of course, people who were expressing dissent to the occupation has been moved out or either in exile, either they were arrested, either the voices of those who opposed Russian forces, Russian authorities there were silenced. So we cannot rely much on what we seen or hearing from the Russian officials in terms of the public sentiment, and people are really afraid to speak out loud if they oppose the occupation and the ongoing invasion.
Let's bring in Zhana Bezbiatchuk, who's in Kyiv. Zhana, how much do people know about what's happening in Crimea? Russia has controlled that territory for so long now. Is there an expectation from people there in Kyiv that they might have to give up that part of their country?
Yeah, exactly. And I have to acknowledge that for us, journalists, it's very difficult to keep any real connection with the people in the Crimea because Russia has isolated the peninsula from mainland Ukraine and from the other regions of Ukraine. So it's really difficult, and it's sometimes dangerous for people who stay in the Crimea to keep any contacts with the people in Ukraine. From what we know and what we understand, that it's important to keep in mind that many citizens of Russia from various regions of this country, they moved to the Crimea after it was illegally annexed by the Russian government and forces. And in fact, the structure of the population has changed. Hundreds of thousands had to flee after Russia had annexed the Crimea because they had strong pro-Ukrainian views and identity. Around 50,000 of the Crimean Tatars who historically lived in the Crimea, for this nation is their homeland. They also had to move either to Ukraine or abroad because that wasn't possible for them to stay in the Crimea after its illegal annexation by Russia. As it was mentioned already, really the Ukrainian military intelligence and other Ukrainian forces, they regularly target the military infrastructure in the Crimea. It's not possible to say that the Crimea managed to stay outside the war and it's not affected by it. It's not fully safe there. We understand that the situation is very complicated, and so far the Ukrainian government and society, they don't have the clear answer how it will be possible and when it will be possible to regain this Ukrainian territory.
Jana, thank you. We also have this question coming into us from Natalia in Zotomir, which is just west of Kyiv. She asks, for 4 years, Europe has been hesitating instead of showing resolve and applying several pressure tools on Russia at once. So is Europe ready for decisive action to end the war in Ukraine on just terms? Or will it continue expressing concern and worry? Her sentiment is echoed by Jose here in the UK. It should be obvious by now that Putin will not deviate from his original intentions in Ukraine. NATO should send him an ultimatum to leave Ukraine or be pushed out. But is there political will to do it? Orisia, I will just put this question to you. I guess both Natalia and Joyce are wondering maybe perhaps if there will be European military action on the ground in Ukraine, boots on the ground?
I think Natalia's question really reflects the sentiment now and certain, anger of Ukrainians vis-a-vis its European partners, because rhetorically we hear statements that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, or Ukraine is integral part of European security. But then the question is how these words are backed by action. And I think this is really the crunch time for Europe, because it probably by now understood that United States is not going to end this war on the terms that would actually strengthen security in Europe. And Europe has to get its own act together on three things. On one hand, it has to have alignment of strategy. This is the war of attrition at industrial scale. And there has to be a clear understanding that Putin must not win, and that it must be seen to lose, and his gains should not be consolidated, because it will be a springboard for further invasion. We hear some of it we've heard it from President Macron. Yesterday, German Chancellor Scholz, in his speech in Bundestag, started with it, saying that Putin will not get a victory in Ukraine. Now, that strategy must be backed by resources, first of all, military, because the high-intensity war goes on. And that means for Ukraine long-range missiles, and here UK and France can do much more. Germany also has long-range missiles, and it's air defense to protect cities in Ukraine, to be able to continue resistance, to produce armaments that is needed, and to keep economy afloat. And it's also choking Russia of its resources. And that, first of all, of course, is oil and gas. The sanctions that have been introduced by United States have to be strictly enforced on these big Russian state oil companies. We do see the income falling, but also the action has to be taken around shadow fleet, and a lot of that shadow fleet goes through the Baltic Sea, and this is the Nordic and Baltic countries together have to set up the right policing force to make sure that these flows are disrupted. As part of resources, I would like also to speak about Russian sovereign assets. This has been now for nearly 4 years discussed. These 300 billion have been frozen, but they have not been really repurposed for Ukraine. And this is the question of urgency, especially as American direct assistance to Ukraine has collapsed this year. All the weapons that Ukraine received from the United States had to be purchased by Europe, and Europe was only able to put roughly 2.22 billion euros for that purposes. That is significant decrease compared to what US was giving before. So Ukraine reparation loan will be discussed at the European Council again in December, and it's a matter of life and death for Ukraine right now, whether these resources will be able to will be directed. And NATO, it's a fair question, but NATO is not able to act as a bloc to counter Russia. It's a defensive bloc, and we see the coalition of the willing emerging from member states of NATO, outside of NATO. And these countries should be discussing, rather than deployment of forces in Ukraine, joint military and defense production with Ukraine to make sure that the front line is moving in the opposite direction, then Putin is not making any territorial gains.
Orisia, thank you. We have a question from the BBC Russian service, an audience member there again, asking, is there any chance that President Zelensky will stay for a second term? Zhana, I'll just bring you in on this. I guess this is pointing to some of the corruption scandals we've seen there in Ukraine involving some of the president's closest allies and friends. This morning we heard reports that his top aide, Andrew Yermak's home, was being raided by anti-corruption officers. Just bring us up to date on what's happening and where this has left President Zelensky's reputation.
Yeah, exactly. The anti-corruption authorities came to search the place where the head of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak, stays, and he has the reputation of the second most influential and powerful person in Ukraine after the president himself, and he's really very close to President Zelensky. It's quite obvious for the Ukrainian civil society, for the Ukrainian public, that this huge, it's really large-scale corruption scandal at one of the largest state-run energy companies in Ukraine might have a real impact on the level of the public support for President Zelensky. We don't know yet what this impact is for now, because we have to wait basically for the opinion polls. The previous opinion surveys showed in 2025, in summer, in September 2025, that Zelensky has quite a high level of the trust of the Ukrainian public, over 50-55% for sure. And now we have to wait for the new measurement of this public support for the president. At the same time, I think it's a very important historical and political moment in the life of Ukraine. For many Ukrainians, it's necessary to understand that first, it has the country has the functional, capable anti-corruption authorities that can really investigate the possible misdoings and violations of people that are even very close to the president. There is no high-ranking official in Ukraine that has anymore the immunity against such investigations. And I think it's seen by many as the huge achievement, even amid the war and difficult peace talks.
Thank you, Zhana. Let's bring in Sergei from BBC Russian. Sergei, how is this playing out in Moscow briefly? We only have about a minute.
Vladimir Putin has been mocking around the situation with the corruption scandal in Ukraine, and obviously it's a softball for him. He says that, well, look at them, they've stolen everything there, despite his own corruption problems in his own country and his own army, which are large scale and which are way bigger than what has been happening in Ukraine. Like, the corruption is basically the foundation of the Russian regime. So, but still, as brief as it can be, for Vladimir Putin, the more hard the situation is for Zelensky, the more difficult position Zelensky finds himself in, it's the better for the Kremlin, the better for Putin. So, of course, he's happy about this internal political scandal in the country, and he hopes that it would help him to put more pressure on Zelensky to sign an agreement which would be not in favor of Ukraine and Ukrainian society.
Sergey, thank you. Let's bring in James Waterhouse in Kyiv. Finally, James, just talk to us about what's expected to happen in the coming days when it comes to these negotiations.
Well, we're told by the Ukrainian side that a US delegation, the US Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, will return to Kyiv. He's been a regular here over the past week or so. It's thought that the senior US envoy Steve Witkoff will go to Moscow to meet with senior Russian officials as well. Both Ukraine and Russia seem to be buying into the process, verbally at least, but in the words of Vladimir Putin yesterday, no final agreement has been reached. And I think it's not obvious when you look at Ukraine's and Russia's red lines, it is still not clear where they converge.
James,
where
we have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much, James Waterhouse, and thank you for joining us on Your Voice here on BBC News Live.